So, our first speaker this afternoon is Dr. Laurie Daniels, who's a professor of forest ecology at UBC. She's a professor in the forest ecology in the Department of Forest and Conservation Sciences, where she directs something called the Tree Ring Lab at UBC. Laurie investigates the impacts of natural and human disturbances and climate change on forests. She has, along with her research team, she has a number of ongoing projects concerning wildfire, forest dynamics, and social-ecological resilience to climate change across BC. She has a number of enduring partnerships with local, provincial, and national governments, environmental organizations, forest management companies, community forests, and First Nations to ensure that her scientific advances are translated into active conservation, restoration, and management. That's an excerpt from her very long biography outlining a distinguished background. So, Laurie, could you come forward? Thank you.
I've been reduced to tears 3 times in the last 24 hours listening to my co-speakers, which I think speaks to the depth of the conditions in which we live and the urgency with which we need to act. And so I want to share with you some of my ideas about the causes, the consequences, and the solutions, how we can coexist with this new, hotter, drier environment and with the wildfires that have had such great impact on our communities. So I'm here from the University of British Columbia, where I work on the lands of the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish people. And I have the privilege as well of working with Indigenous communities around this province. And so I'm grateful for the knowledge that is shared with me, and I will share with you some of the insights that I have been given permission to share as well through our journey and our collaboration with Indigenous people around BC. I also want to acknowledge that much of what I'm going to share with you is research, the blood, sweat, and tears of many graduate students. I have a big research team built over many years, but since 2017, our team has doubled in size in response to the urgent wildfire situation in BC. We've heard the word unprecedented to describe 2023, and here we are in the Canadian context. Here in BC, 2.85 million hectares of forest burnt this summer. That's twice the record that we set in 2018, which exceeded the record that was set just in 2017. And so in total in British Columbia, 4.5 million hectares have burned in recent years. Across Canada, 18.5 million hectares, and we've seen the charts that show the rate at which those fires built and burnt our forested lands, the amount of carbon emitted into the atmosphere, and we've talked already today about the feedbacks and the consequences for the climate system of those fires and other aspects of our ecosystems. 2023 was hot on the heels of 2021, the heat dome with tremendous impacts. Burning almost 900,000 hectares, which doesn't get to set a record, is mind-boggling in terms of area burned. But of course, the impacts on our human communities was absolutely astounding, with the loss of 90% of the community of Lytton and the loss of life associated with that. These fires were particularly startling to me because much of it burned in our dry forest systems, our ecosystems that are dominated by Douglas fir, like we see around us here on the Gulf Islands, but in the interior, in our warmest and driest climates, where the types of fires, where fires burn treetop to treetop with high impacts, are not what we think historically used to burn. We live in an era of megafires, which really began, again, I'm showing you here the maps, the polygons or patches that were created by the 2017 and 2018 fires, where in back-to-back years we burned over 1 million hectares of forest, largely in the interior of BC, nevertheless impacting the entire province through heat and drought and fire. We know that some of what is happening, a large portion of what is happening, is being driven by climate. If we look back to the year 2003, I look back almost fondly at 2003 when we had our first wake-up call about wildfire. Perhaps you'll recall the fires that burned through Okanagan Mountain Park into the suburbs of Kelowna, the fires that burned in Barrie or Maclure and had impacts in communities in the Shuswap region. In that year, there was about 2,500 fires that in total burned 265,000 hectares, breaking records at that point. And the Okanagan Mountain Park fire burned 25,000 hectares. That was our benchmark. These maps are showing the fire danger in August of 2017 and 2018, July of 2021, June of 2023. The red, it's a heat map. The reds and oranges are telling you extreme and high fire danger. The cooler colors are telling us that it's cooler, lower fire danger. And what I want to point out here is that we have across the province, not just regions, but the entire province showing up as a high and extreme fire danger. And that these conditions are happening not only in the heat of the summer in August, but they're keeping forward into July and then into June. So our fire season is getting longer, starting earlier, lasting longer, with fires still burning right now, despite snow falling in our mountains and our northern systems. Costs are increasing. $370 million seemed like a lot in 2003. This summer cost us $1 billion to not successfully put out the fires that are burning in this landscape. And that's not a criticism of BC wildfire. That's a statement of fact, because the fires that are burning today are burning under hotter and drier conditions in forests that are primed for fire in ways that they did not exist in the past. So let me tell you why that is and how we got there. So clearly, climate and weather are interconnected, and that's a big part of the equation. But I also want to talk about the kinds of changes that have happened in our landscapes over a century of forest change. Here we see fire burning in the wildland-urban interface, a term, the WUI, that John introduced to us yesterday. With fire burning here in the Kootenays, a lightning strike burning adjacent to homes and properties. And so as we can imagine, when fire is near homes and properties, we need to detect and suppress those fires. That policy has been in place for over a century in BC. And it was not only applied to places close to homes and communities, but across our landscape, because the livelihood of BC and the economy was driven much by the forest industry. So protecting all forests and grasslands from fire was public policy until 2012. And we were really good at it. We have world-class firefighters. 96% of fires were put out before they reached 4 hectares in size for many, many decades. That means in our lifetime, we have only experienced the top 6% of fires that burned under extreme fire weather conditions, heat and drought and wind. So what happened to the other 94% of the fires? Those 94% of fires that we successfully put out were the lower intensity surface fires, those that historically burned through the understory of our dry forests, that burned the grasses and the fine twigs and fuels, the organic material turning to ash, incorporating into the soil. It thinned out the forest, preventing seedlings and saplings from becoming too dense. It kept our forests open, woodlands and grasslands with intermittent patches of forest. And those forest fires, those low severity fires, are the ones that were easy to detect, that burned under cooler, wetter conditions, were easily put out over the last century. Here I'm showing you tree rings, and as I said, I direct the tree ring lab at UBC, and so we have hundreds of samples like this one, where here it's a cross section and you can see the center of the tree, the pith, and you'd expect that to be right in the geographical center of that disc from a tree, and yet we see it off-center. And we see it off-center because although that tree established in 1809, a surface fire burned in the understory and damaged a portion of the living tissue, and that fire burned in 1837. And so the tree continued to grow, but was damaged again by a second fire in 1858, and then survived right through to the 1990s when it died from a beetle outbreak. Now we use the tree rings in these Douglas fir, a thick bark Douglas fir, or the backdrop picture, a ponderosa pine that has in that particular tree in the backdrop 52 fire scars that form between the late 1300s and the late 1800s on Yakan Iknukliat, the tobacco plains of the Tanaha people in southeast BC. So these tree ring records tell us about historical fires. And so let me take you up to the Tahalk traditional territory near Williams Lake. And here we're at the Alex Fraser Research Forest in BC. And what I'm showing you is a whole bunch of research plots. Each horizontal line is a plot. The length of the line tells you when the trees, the center of the trees, the pith where they began to grow, dating back to the 1600s. Each of these black triangles is telling you when a fire burned and scarred the trees, but the trees survived to tell the tale. And what you see is lots of fire, lots of surface fire in these ecosystems, burning through the understory, cleaning up, reducing the fuels, creating opportunity for understory plants that are adapted to fire to grow in. Fire that drove this ecosystem and created this old growth forest, because the fires were low intensity and interacted with those trees and plants in such a unique way. The fires used to burn once every decade on average, some ignited by lightning. Many, we know now, both from the oral histories and from the tree rings to support those oral histories, many of those fires were due to Indigenous fire stewardship, a reciprocal give and take with the land, using fire to cleanse the land, to stimulate the plants, to generate the foods, the medicines, the ceremonies that sustained life for time immemorial in these forests. Those forests were open canopied forests with grasslands interspersed with them. They held with them abundant biodiversity. Some of that biodiversity is the red and blue listed species today, as those dry forests are lost from the landscape. And how are they lost? Well, in absence of all these fires, these red intervals, fire-free intervals that go back a century in a forest that used to burn once every decade or two. In absence of fire, well, we have an epidemic of trees. Trees that encroach in, that grow in the understory and fill in the forest and create from woodlands dense forests with trees that are small and intermediate and large size that can carry fire now from the surface into their canopies, higher and higher into the canopy, creating crown fires that spread treetop to treetop and damage and kill the living tissues. Whereas those trees with their protective thick bark used to survive a surface fire, they can't survive the crown fires that are sustained in these tree-rich environments. Those trees are stressed. They're stressed by drought. They're less resistant to insects and to pathogens, many of which are endemic or natural in the system, but combined with climate change are going to epidemic proportions with impacts on our forests not previously observed, but contributing to the fuels in the landscapes. And so we've created a perfect storm so that now when fire burns, it's no longer those surface fires that we so successfully put out. The paradox, by trying to protect these forests from fire, we've created a tinderbox so that when fires burn, they burn as high severity. And here we are at the Elephant Hill Fire on the traditional territory of the Stucktaus and the Skeechesin First Nations. And here this fire, almost 200,000 hectares, the reds and oranges are telling us it burned at high and moderate severity, killing trees throughout those zones instead of scarring them. Instead of cleaning up those forests, we've shifted the state of the way both fire and the forests are functioning. I'm here to tell you that our coastal forests are not immune. I've described for you the interior dry forests, Douglas fir dominated forests, and I want to bring us back to the coast. We've heard today about coastal Douglas fir forests. We're here in the coastal Douglas fir bioclimatic zone. We're in a forest that has a lot of Douglas fir mixed with cedar and other species. And I just wanted to remind us that we live in the rain shadow. We heard about, the west coast of the island, the windward side of the mountains, the insular range down the center of Vancouver Island, the Olympic Peninsula, creating this rain shadow that creates these very droughty conditions, particularly in the summer. And that influences us greatly. Our steep terrain, our summer drought. Many second growth forests that accumulate woody material that is hazardous and can burn, and our extensive wildland urban interface. So many of us live embedded in these forests that have fuel in them and that we have experienced in recent years become so dry in the summer. Although risk seems only moderate, when we think about it in the larger context of the province, the hot, dry southern interior being more at risk of fire than our coastal environments moderated by the ocean. The consequence, because of our high density of people and our communities so embedded in these forests, is huge. I would have told you up until 2015 that fire is really rare in coastal systems, but as John pointed out last night, Boulder Creek and Ilaho valleys burning in 2015, creating smoke that inundated the lower mainland and much of the Gulf Islands. The fires we've seen on Vancouver Island, on the west side of Vancouver Island, in our coastal temperate rainforests, on the Sunshine Coast, in the lower mainland, in the last 5 to 7 years, have really changed our perspective. Much of that driven, again, by climate change, but in these forests that are susceptible, in a landscape embedded with people. Now, I want you to reimagine landscapes that we live in, and I'm going to describe a history, a long-term history that I find so fascinating, and it's one, much like our tree ring history, that has made me reconsider BC's ecosystems and our forests, and try to reimagine how we might live embedded in these ecosystems. So I'm going to borrow from some work by a graduate student, now professor, Anne Bjorkman, whose work was here in coastal BC, or on the east side of Vancouver Island, and her work was centered on the Cowichan Bay, so not far from here. And here's the satellite view showing us, second growth Douglas fir forests dominating this beautiful green, forest-rich environment. Not very different from here on Hornby Island. What Anne did was identified the maps, the first maps that were built in the 1850s and 70s. These are hand-drawn maps from surveys that were done pre-European settlement to describe the ecosystems of the area. So what we see today is a beautiful forest dominated by Douglas fir. Those early, the early surveys indicated were pine plains and prairies. Oaks and pine plains, oaks and maple. And when I look at the maps, the same maps for the lower mainland for Richmond, it's all about the prairie. I grew up on the tallgrass prairie in Winnipeg. I can guarantee to you coastal forests and a prairie look really different. And yet here they were in the 1850s to the 1870s describing these landscapes that we stand in today as a forest. It was then a prairie or a plain with scattered trees, the oaks, the Douglas firs, the pines. Gary Oak with these grassy understories that we now have good paleo and oral histories that remind us Indigenous people in these landscapes were using fire here as well to tend these lands, to create these plains and these prairies with interspersed trees that enriched those understories, that created the food plants. And here, a picture of a Songhees woman collecting the camas, a food source cultivated by fire here in our coastal systems associated with the Gary Oak ecosystem. So my ears were tweaked when I heard about Hallowell and that there's a Gary Oak ecosystem that you're restoring, that there's scattered large Douglas fir trees that formed an overstory canopy that I suspect was much more open historically than the forests you see here today on beautiful Hornby Island and Denman Island and Salt Spring Island and all the other islands and down the east side of Vancouver Island, where these ecosystems have changed dramatically in the last century. And so the impact of colonization, the impact on Indigenous people, the heartbreaking story that Elder Barb shared with us today about the stolen lands as of 1958 and the change in the ecosystems that have resulted in a century and a bit of change have put us in a very vulnerable situation. And so it also raised for me a little bit of hope when I heard the challenge come from Rick, for us to revision what our land could look like and how we might like to live in this environment. So knowing that there are different ways for these ecosystems to be sustained, states that can differ in terms of composition and structure, knowing that there's a history, a rich history of rich understory plant diversity with fewer trees, a system that would be more resilient and resistant to fire, we have some guidance. We have ecological and cultural guidance that could help give us some pointers on where we might go in a landscape that is vulnerable to climate change. So let me make some suggestions. There was a question last night about what are the solutions? What might solutions look like? Well, what do we do with our dense, beautiful, tree-rich environment that we now live in? We're going to learn to coexist and have some transformative change. Many have shared with me their vision that it's not if, but when. It's not if, but when fire will visit this environment. So will we be ready? Can we make some transformations that will make us more resilient? I think guided by Indigenous knowledge and our understanding of these historical regimes and the kinds of ecosystems that may result from them can help guide us in terms of proactive management. And here, I think some people might not be pleased with what I'm going to suggest next, but I think removing some of the trees, not the big, beautiful, biodiverse trees, but the understory trees that infilled in absence of the surface fires from cultural fire, from the changes to the land that have allowed very dense forests to come in. Those are the latter fuels, those are the fuels that put us at risk. So let's remove some of those small trees that are the fuels that could make a small surface fire become a crown fire that is hard to stop, that has such high impacts both on the ecosystems and our human communities. Let's use our tools available to us in an environment where there's high risk of fire and huge human consequence. Let's pretend to be a surface fire and restore the ecosystem with a light touch, but using the technology available to us to thin those forests and remove those fuel-laden trees. So I'm going to quiz you. You live in this beautiful place. Can you spot the wildfire problem? Do you recognize any patches of forest near your home that look like the one on the top? Hundreds to thousands of subcanopy trees, very, very dense, slow-growing fuels, but not really adding a lot to the value of this ecosystem, impacting the diversity of the understory that can grow there. Our human impacts, where we kind of pile the wood, the debris that we don't want, but often creating caches in the forest that could be a serious consequence in a fire season with a fire spreading out of control. Can you spot the wildfire problem? Wildland firefighters have spent an exorbitant amount of time in 2017, 2018, 2021, and 2023 fire smarting properties, restacking firewood, moving barbecues away from homes, moving materials that were highly flammable but leaning up against people's homes after they had evacuated. Those are all actions that we can take to free up better opportunities for those wildland firefighters to attribute their energy in more productive ways. How about this one? I've had the pleasure of living in beautiful environments in mountains in Colorado, in the Kootenays, in coastal BC, here on the Gulf Islands for a short period. And I've seen a lot of this, but it's a fire hazard. So we can make choices that are smart and wise to prepare us for fire. And so the solutions, I'm going to say, start at home. They start with every single one of us in this room to become aware of the fire risk in which we live, to understand the ecosystems in which we coexist, and to think about how we can be better prepared. So I'm going to encourage each of you to take a look at the FireSmart websites and to think about how you could prepare your home for fire, because it's not if, it's when. And then work together as a community. Some of our proactive restoration and fuel mitigation, as I said, takes the form of some light touch thinning of the forest to remove those understory trees that have grown in absence of the natural disturbances, whether they were lightning ignited or indigenous fire stewardship that kept those forests open and fuel reduced. We have taken that ecosystem process away, and as a result, our landscapes are full of trees and fuel. So we can remove some of that fuel, leaving behind the big, thick-barked, fire-resistant trees, the ones that are important for habitat. We can leave heterogeneity on the landscape, but closest to our homes, let's make sure that we've reduced the fuels and reduced the risk to our homes and neighborhoods. Our models here, and I've given you an example from Logan Lake, is where in the areas that were treated with fuels by removing those understory trees, when we before there was a treatment, almost half the fires, or over half the fires, were either passive crown fire or active crown fire. Only 32% of our study area would have burned as surface fire. But we changed that. We shifted fire, we shifted fire to 80% surface fire simply by thinning out the understory. And this was computer modeling, but that modeling proved true when fire burned into the community forest surrounding Logan Lake. And where there was no treatment, 75 to 100% of the trees died or were scorched and the ground burnt to mineral soil. Whereas the treated areas, less than 20% tree mortality.
That worked.
The soil was intact. The plants regenerated.
It was just there 2 weeks ago. It looks beautiful now.
It does, doesn't it? Yeah, thank you for that comment. And it's a success story. It was using these areas where the treatments had occurred that they were able to use those boundaries to defend the community, created defensible space and used it to defend the community, and not at one home burnt in Logan Lake in 2021. So I use this as an example. Beautiful forests remain, and they took an adaptive approach. So I'm here to help educate and engage these wonderful citizens on your island to think about using those FireSmart and community protection plans. We need to, at the provincial level, diversify how we manage our forests and fire. I'm glad to answer questions about that after. Clearly, Western science combined with Indigenous knowledge can lead us to the answers to these problems. And again, I'm here as a university professor, and there's others in the room who are researchers and engaged in these kinds of topics. We're happy to work with communities to talk about evidence-based, adaptive, proactive, community-needed research, and to work with your communities to help to understand the problem and to find solutions. I've been asked over and over by the media, is this a wake-up call? Is this a wake-up call? Is this a wake-up call? If we're not woke by now, I'm not sure what we can do. But I want to share with you an insight from the last few years, and maybe this is why some of what I hear from John and from Rick and from others brings tears to my eyes. Because it's been 20 years since Firestorm 2003. And our communities and our ecosystems are not resilient to wildfire. Our communities are not ready, and climate change is upon us. So the transformative change is urgently needed if we're going to coexist with fire. And I welcome your questions.
Okay, we'll take a couple of questions of Lori now, and then she'll be here for the panel discussion
Absolutely.
afterwards.
You talked a bit about the increase with the modern fires, the super fires, we're killing the trees instead of just scorching them. Are you seeing that on the coast? Like I'm thinking of like the Tassos fire of a year or two ago, and some of the other fires that we're seeing in Vancouver Island. Are they killing the trees as well, or are they more like they used to be and just scorching them, and the trees continue to live after that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So are the fires on the coast showing the same patterns as we saw at Logan Lake, for example, or some of these high intensity fires in the interior? I think there's a real mix. The ones that I've seen in the lower mainland, I think of the Hope Flood fire down near Hope that created so much smoke and fall of, actually in 2022, it was just last fall that was burning. You know, it burns. We know on the ground, you know, in our coastal forests, we have this huge accumulation of organic material, very, very thick forest floors that smolder and create smoke and generate a lot of heat energy that impacts the soils, scorches the roots and the base of those trees, and kills many of them, maybe indirectly by not necessarily reaching to the crowns. And then we also see the crown fire under extreme conditions kind of flaring up and traveling treetop to treetop. So I think in our coastal forests, it's sometimes an indirect impact of that burning, that smoldering burning down on the surface of the ground, consuming the forest floor, damaging the roots, and causing, it might be lagged by a year or two, but fairly high mortality of the trees. Assessing the mortality is a really important step that we need to take after these fires. We can do it in part by remote sensing, satellite images looking before and after, which is how I created that map for Elephant Hill, but also getting on the ground and verifying that what the satellite perceived was actually what happened is really important. We can't fast track our way through the questions and answers. So I think really getting out onto more of those sites on the coast and looking on the ground, collaborating with the foresters who might have already been out in those areas to answer those questions is a really important step.
Right here.
I'm going to maybe shift it to another thought. So in all your work, did you ever assess the impact of beavers on the landscape? Because, you know, beavers were everywhere all the time until we extirpated them, and slowly they've come back.
Yeah.
And one of the things we're trying to do on Deadman is, you know, make beavers work again. And, you know, there's been lots of good work, especially on the Pacific Northwest coast, on comparing what happens when you do have beavers and when you don't in terms of wildfire resilience. Did you see any of that?
Yeah, so I've not worked specifically on any beaver questions, but you've highlighted a really important point. And the question was, you know, what role are beavers playing, and how might they play an important role in these ecosystems? I might step that back and say, in general, many of our management actions over the last century, whether intentional or unintentional, contributed to making very uniform, homogeneous landscapes. The more homogeneous they are, and the more fuel in them, the more likely they are to have very large, intense fires that build energy and momentum and are difficult to stop. The more variability, the more heterogeneity and variation, the better, because that creates fuel breaks and fire breaks and ecosystem diversity and opportunities for biodiversity. It changes fire behavior and it changes the impacts on the ecosystems. So beavers would have been one of many ways in which we had heterogeneity in the landscape historically, and we've removed that factor and allowed those ecosystems to homogenize as a result. So any way we can be thinking creatively about creating variation and heterogeneity, I think is a step in the right direction. But again, a lesson to be learned. You know, we thought we were doing the right thing by putting out fires for many, many decades. And the paradox is, of course, we made it worse. So those unintended consequences, we need to think them through carefully and be willing to kind of be open to bouncing our ideas and getting feedback and looking for the unintended consequence that might result, and to think through those problems. And then monitor and adapt and make a change if we chose the wrong thing as we take steps forward, and then sideways, and maybe back, and hopefully forward again.
Okay. Thank you very much, Laurie.